Okay. That was dumb. YouTube hides the button behind a scroll bar that isn't there. Okay. Late on election night, 2020, President Trump addressed the nation from the East Room of the White House. When Trump spoke at 2:21 a.m. on November 4th, the president's re-election was very much in doubt. Fox News, a conservative media outlet, had correctly called Arizona for former Vice President Joseph R. Biden. Every Republican presidential candidate since 1996 had won Arizona. If the president lost the state, and in the days ahead it became clear that he had, then his campaign was in trouble. But as the votes continued to be counted, President Trump's apparent early lead in other key states he needed to win, steadily shrank. Soon he would not be in the lead at all. He'd be losing. So the President of the United States did something he had planned to do long before the election day. He lied. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. President Trump said. We were getting ready to win this election, the president continued. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election, Trump claimed without offering any evidence that a major fraud was occurring in our nation. Neither of President Trump's claims were true. He had no basis for claiming victory or that fraud was taking place. Millions of votes still had not been counted. The states were simply tabulating the ballots cast by the American people. Trump's own campaign advisors told him to wait, that it was far too early to declare victory. As the evening progressed, President Trump called in his campaign team to discuss the results. Trump campaign manager William Stepien and other campaign experts advised him that the results of the election would not be known for some time and that he could not truthfully declare victory. Need a list of people. Yes, the chat does work. Although it doesn't show you as a viewer. Look, concurrent viewers 0. That's weird. Does the... Yes, it does work. Oh, there we go. Now you're there. What's up, Joe Neal? We're going to make the Jan 6 video. Well, we as in chat. Thank you. It's a lot of cool stuff. Oh, that refreshes it. Oh, no, there it is. Logo boxes. You've even got a standby. Look at that. Stock image shit. William Stepien. Trump campaign manager William Stepien and other campaign experts advised him that the results of the election would not be known for some time and that he could not truthfully declare victory. Stepien was of the view that because ballots were going to be counted for days, it was far too early to be making any proclamation about having won the election. Stepien told President Trump that his recommendation was to say, "Votes are still being counted. It's too early to call the race." Say, "Votes are still being counted. It's too early to call the race." Jason Miller, another senior Trump campaign advisor, told the Select Committee that he argued in conversations with Stepien and others that night against declaring victory at the time as well, because it was too early to say one way or the other who had won. Miller recalled recommending that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers. Jason Miller, campaign advisor, Jason Miller. Jason Miller also the Defense 6 committee that he said the same. According to testimony received by the committee, the only advisor present who supported President Trump's inclination to declare victory was Rudy Giuliani, who, according to Miller, was definitely intoxicated that evening. President Trump's decision to declare victory falsely on election night and unlawfully to call for the vote counting to stop was not a spontaneous decision. It was premeditated. The committee has assembled a range of evidence of President Trump's pre-planning for a false declaration of victory. This includes multiple written communications on October 31st and November 3rd, 2020, to the White House by Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton. This evidence demonstrates that Fitton was in direct contact with President Trump and understood that he would falsely declare victory on election night and call for vote counting to stop. The evidence also includes an audio recording of President Trump's advisor Steve Bannon, who said this on October 31st, 2020, to a group of his associates from China. Quote, "And what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. The Democrats, more of our people vote early that count. Their vote in mail. And so they're going to have a natural disadvantage. And Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. So when you wake up Wednesday morning, it's going to be a firestorm. Also, if Trump is losing by 10 or 11 o'clock at night, it's going to be even crazier. No, because he's going to sit right there and say, they stole it. I'm directing the Attorney General to shut down all ballot places in all 50 states. It's going to be, no, he's not going out easy. If Biden's winning, Trump is going to do some crazy shit. Jesus, Steve Bannon actually said that shit? October 31st. Communications October 31st. Also in advance of the election, Roger Stone, another outside advisor to President Trump, made this statement. I really do suspect it will still be up in the air. When that happens, the key thing to do is claim victory. Possession is 9/10 of the law. No, we won, fuck you, sorry, over, we won, you're wrong, fuck you. Jesus, these people are ghouls. Events of the election. In the days after the election, the president's own campaign team told him he had lost and there was no evidence of significant fraud. When his campaign staff wouldn't tell him what he wanted to hear, President Trump replaced them with what Attorney General William Barr described as a clown car of individuals willing to promote various conspiracy theories. But Donald Trump was no passive consumer of these lies. He actively propagated them. Time and again, President Trump was informed that his election fraud claims were not true. He chose to spread them anyway. He did so even after they were legally tested and rejected in dozens of lawsuits. Not even the Electoral College's certification of former Vice President Biden's victory on December 14th, 2020 stopped the president from lying. Throughout, the big lie remained central to President Trump's efforts to block the peaceful transfer of power on January 6, 2021. Big Lie reflected deliberate exploitation of the red mirage. How are we going to organize this? Where's the... Table of contents. Big lie. The big lie reflected deliberate exploitation of the Red Mirage. Trump's pre-election plans to declare victory. Trump's pre-election efforts to delegitimize the election process. I wonder... The big lie reflected deliberate exploitation of the Red Mirage. President Trump's big lie on election night was based on simple differences in how Americans vote. In 2020, it was well known that Democrats were much more likely to vote via mail-in ballots than in person in 2020. On the other hand, Republicans generally preferred to vote in person on Election Day. In key swing states, with tight margins between the candidates, the Election Day votes would favor President Trump and disproportionately be counted first. Mail-in ballots, which would favor former Vice President Biden, would disproportionately be counted later. In some states, it would take days to process the remaining mail-in ballots. The timing of how votes are counted created the potential for what is known as a red mirage, or an illusion of a Republican victory in the early stages of vote counting. President Trump would appear to be in the lead on election night, but this was not the whole picture. Many mail-in votes for former Vice President Biden, would not be counted on election day. Therefore, the actual winner would likely not be known on election night. The red mirage phenomenon was widely known prior to the 2020 presidential election. Chris Stirewalt was the head of the Fox News elections desk that correctly called Arizona for Biden. Stirewalt and his team tried to warn viewers of the red mirage. He testified that over the past 40 or 50 years, Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, and that Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans. In nearly every election, Stirewalt elaborated, Republicans win election day and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting. It happens every time. President Trump's campaign team made sure that the president was briefed on the timing of vote tallying. All right, hold on. Stirewalt. Chris Stirewalt. President Trump's campaign team made sure the president was briefed on the timing of vote tallying. Stepien, his campaign manager, told the select committee that President Trump was reminded on Election Day that large numbers of mail-in ballots would still remain to be counted over the coming days. Stepien added that he personally reminded the president that while early returns may be favorable, the counting would continue. I recounted back to 2016 when I had a very similar conversation with him on Election Day. I recounted back to that conversation with him in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night, I told him in 2020 that, it was going to be a process again, as, the early returns are going to be positive. Then we're going to, be watching the returns of ballots as, they rolled in thereafter. Ordinarily, the red mirage anomaly does not create problems in the election process because candidates wait for the votes to be tallied before declaring victory or conceding. As Stirewalt emphasized, prior to President Trump, no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. President Trump, however, made a different choice. In an extraordinary breach of the American democratic process, he decided to exploit the potential for confusion about the staggered timing of vote counting to deceive the American public about the election results. He and his allies foreshadowed this decision in their statements in the months leading up to the November 2020 election. I remember that when he was talking about how, well, that was the idea that the Dems were stealing it. That's what they kept saying. Why is that the same color as the text? That should be a different color. God damn it. On Halloween, advisor Steve Bannon, let's do this. Halloween, advisor Steve Bannon, who had served 4 years earlier as Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager, laid out the election night plan. What Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory, but that doesn't mean he's a winner. Bannon told a private audience he's just going to say he's a winner. Bannon explained that the Democrats would have a natural disadvantage on election night because more Democrats would vote by mail than Republicans, and it would take time to count the mail-in ballots. This would give President Trump the illusion of a lead, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. Bannon said, "That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner." This is when? On October 31st? In an interview on Fox News the morning of the election, November 4th. Wait, November 3rd. That's the 2020 election date. November 3rd, okay. November 3rd. Bannon interviewed on Fox News. Bannon insisted that President Trump needed to address the nation that night to provide the narrative engine for how we go forward. During an episode of his podcast later that same day, Bannon clarified what he meant. President Trump is going to claim victory, right? He's going to claim victory. Fox News and said Trump needed to Tom Fitton drafted a victory statement for the president to read on election night. On October 31st, he emailed the statement to President Trump's assistant, Molly Michael, a social media guru, and social media guru Dan Scavino. Fitton wrote that election day, November 3rd, was the deadline by which voters in states across the country must choose a president. Fitton argued that counting ballots that arrived after Election Day would be part of an effort by partisans to overturn the election results. Fitton. I don't know who Tom Fitton is. Does anybody know who Tom Fitton? Do you know who Tom Fitton is? And President Trump's assistant was Molly Michael. Social media guru Dan Scavino. Of course, that claim was not true. Mail-in ballots are regularly processed after Election Day. Regardless, Fitton encouraged the president to preemptively declare victory. "We had an election today, and I won," Fitton wrote for President Trump. Early in the evening on Election Day, Fitton emailed Michael again to say he had just talked to the president about the draft statement. Later that evening, before President Trump made his election night remarks, Molly Michael replied that she was redelivering to him now. What is this? I can't download that image. Save. Okay, take me out of dark mode. You can't invert colors in Paint anymore? Why? Invert selection? Guess we're not seeing that photo. Roger Stone. Do we have him? Trump's longtime political confidant. Roger Stone told several associates just prior to the election that Trump needed to declare victory, especially if the race wasn't called on Election Day. "Let's just hope we're celebrating on election night," Stone said. "I really do suspect it will still be up in the air. When that happens, the key thing is to claim victory." Stone elaborated with colorful language. "Possession is 9/10 of the law. No, we won, fuck you, sorry. Over, we won, you're wrong, fuck you." Indeed, published reports echoed these warnings about President Trump's election strategy. 2 days before the election, Jonathan Swan of Axios reported that President Trump has told confidants that he'll declare victory on Tuesday night if it looks like he's ahead. Swan added that Trump's team is preparing to falsely claim that mail-in ballots counted after November 3rd, a legitimate count expected to favor Democrats, are evidence of election fraud. If the vote tally swung against Trump after election night in states such as Pennsylvania, then the Trump team would claim the Democrats had stolen the election. Fox News election analyst Chris Stirewalt testified that he and his team had gone to pains to inform viewers that early votes would favor Republicans, but the lead would be illusory because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try and exploit this anomaly. Others warned that Trump could exploit the red mirage as well. That was right around the time where Trump started questioning Fox, wasn't it? He started disowning them because they were calling him out. Trump's pre-election efforts to delegitimize the election process. President Trump also paved the way for his false election night declaration of victory by blanketing voters with a blizzard of lies and statements delegitimizing mail-in voting in the middle of a deadly pandemic and consistently questioning the security of ballots. President Trump used the president's bully pulpit, including his heavily trafficked Twitter feed, to tell one lie after another. The Select Committee found dozens of instances in which President Trump claimed that mail-in voting would produce a rigged election. Trump repeatedly denounced mail-in voting on Twitter during interviews and even during the presidential debate. Here's a small sample of President Trump's attempts to delegitimize mail-in balloting. Oof. On April 7th, 2020, President Trump claimed mail ballots, quote, "Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters. They go and collect them. They're fraudulent in many cases. These mailed ballots come in. The mailed ballots are corrupt, in my opinion, and they collect them and they get people to go in and sign them, and then they're forgeries in many cases. It's a horrible thing." The following day, he tweeted, "Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to a statewide mail-in voting. Democrats are clamoring for it. Tremendous potential for voter fraud, and for whatever reason, doesn't work out well for Republicans. For whatever reason." Jesus. On May 24th, President Trump tweeted, "The United States cannot have all mail-in ballots. It will be the greatest rigged election in history. People grab them from mailboxes, print thousands of forgeries, and force people to sign. Also, forge names. Some absentee okay when necessary, trying to use COVID for this scam." September 17th, he falsely alleged that mail-in ballots were ripe for foreign interference. There's a quote, "There is a group of people, largely radical left Democrats, that want election mayhem. States must end this crazy mass sending of ballots. Also a gift to foreign interference into our election. Stop it now before it's too late." Before the election, as President Trump campaigned against mail-in voting, Bill Stepien sought an intercession. Along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Stepien attempted to convince the president that mail-in voting was not a bad thing for his campaign. They argued that President Trump's decision to discourage mail-in voting, while urging his voters to vote only on Election Day, leaves a lot to chance, and would fail to take advantage of a superior grassroots operation that could encourage Trump voters to return their ballots. President Trump did not heed their warning. He continued to demonize mail-in voting. The Red Mirage was a key part of his big lie. Kevin McCarthy. House. Where fuck was it? House Minority. Kevin McCarthy. Stepien and Bill Stepien and Kevin McCarthy tried to convince Trump to utilize mail-in ballots, but he decided to demonize them instead. Ominously, President Trump consistently refused to commit to accepting the outcome of the election. During an interview on Fox News in July, Chris Wallace asked, quote, "Can you give a direct answer if you will accept the election?" President Trump responded, "I have to see. Look, and I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no, and I didn't last time either." On September 3rd, 2020, a reporter asked President Trump if he would commit to a peaceful transfer of power after the election. The president refused, saying, "We're going to have to see what happens." The president claimed the ballots are a disaster, adding that if he could get rid of the ballots, we'll have a very peaceful, there won't be a transfer, frankly, there'll be a continuation. That is, according to President Trump, there would be a continuation of his presidency. The following day, September 24th, another reporter followed up by asking if the election would be legitimate only if President Trump won. The president again suggested there was something suspect about mail-in ballots, adding that he was not sure the election could be an honest one. September. September what? 23rd. September 24th. President Trump's launch of the big lie. Consistent with the pre-election narrative planted by President Trump, within hours of the polls closing, President Trump began pushing the claim that late reported vote tallies were illegitimate, even though he had been reminded by his campaign manager that very day that a large number of mail-in ballots would not be counted for several days or hours. President Trump claimed that Democrats were going to find ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. He also suggested that Democrats were continuing to vote after the polls had closed. Indeed, this is exactly what Steve Bannon described when he said President Trump would take advantage of the Democrats' natural disadvantage on election night. In the ensuing days and weeks, President Trump often referred to dumps of votes that were injected into the counting process. His supporters latched onto these false claims. There were no dumps of votes, just tallies of absentee ballots as they were reported by jurisdictions throughout the country in a fully transparent process. These batches of ballots included votes for both Trump and Biden. The late reported votes favored the former vice president, just as President Trump's campaign advisors said they would, particularly in primarily Democratic cities. Attorney General Bill Barr recognized immediately that the red mirage was the basis for President Trump's erroneous claim of fraud. Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway, Barr said. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. President Trump's claim seemed to be based on the dynamic that, at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states, and that seemed to be the basis for this broad claim that there was major fraud. President Trump knew about the red mirage. He chose to lie about it repeatedly, even after being directly informed that his claims were false. This was often the case in the post-election period. The president consciously disregarded facts that did not support his big lie. Post-election, President Trump replaces his campaign team. President Trump's campaign leadership, including Bill Stepien, the campaign's manager, and Justin Clark, the campaign's deputy manager, Justin Clark. Justin Clark. President Trump's campaign leadership, including Bill Stepien and Justin Clark, supported President Trump and were willing to pursue recounts and other standard post-election litigation, but they were not willing to promote baseless conspiracy theories. Stepien and others characterized this group as Team Normal. Stepien, Justin Clark, and others deemed themselves Team Normal and were willing to Less than 2 weeks after the election, President Trump pushed Team Normal aside because its members didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. In their place, Trump promoted Rudy Giuliani and his associates, men and women who spread baseless and extreme claims of election fraud. Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, recruited several investigators and lawyers to assist him. Giuliani's team included Jenna Ellis, Bernard Kerik, Boris Epshteyn, Catherine Fries, and Christina Bobb. Ellis, Bernard Kerik, Boris Epstein. Catherine Price. And Christina Bob. Ellis functioned as Giuliani's deputy on the new Trump campaign legal team. Oh, okay. Ellis. Carrick, the former commissioner of the New York Police Department and a pardoned felon, served as Giuliani's chief investigator. Other attorneys who collaborated with Giuliani's legal team included Sidney Powell, Cleta Mitchell, and John Eastman. Sidney Power. Sidney Power. As discussed elsewhere in this report, Eastman became a key player in President Trump's efforts to overturn the election. President Trump's campaign team told him he lost the election and there was no significant fraud. President Trump's campaign team quickly realized that none of the significant fraud claims were real. Bill Stepien testified that as of November 5th, the Trump campaign had not found any proof of fraudulent activity. There were allegations and reports, but nothing hard and fast that drew the results of the election into question. The Trump campaign continued to investigate claims of fraud into the second week after the election. According to Stepien, as people shared wild allegations with the president, the campaign team was forced to review the facts and then serve as a truth-telling squad to the president regarding why the claims didn't prove to be true. For example, Stepien recalled someone alleging that thousands of illegal votes had been cast in Arizona. That wasn't true. The votes had been submitted by overseas voters, such as military deployed or stationed abroad, who were obviously eligible to participate in the election. Alex Cannon was a lawyer for the Trump campaign and previously worked for the Trump Organization. After the election, Cannon was tasked with looking into allegations of voter fraud in the 2020 election, including the claim that thousands of ineligible votes had been cast in Arizona. Cannon recalled that Vice President Pence asked him what he was finding, and I said I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election, Cannon responded. Vice President Pence thanked him. Cannon reported his assessment to Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, as well. In mid to late November 2020, Meadows asked Cannon what his investigation had turned up. And I remember sharing with him that we weren't finding anything that would be sufficient to change the results in any of the key states, Cannon told Meadows. So there is no there, Meadows replied. White House chief of staff. Jason Miller, do we have him already? Campaign advisor. Jason Miller, a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, pushed claims of election fraud in public. In private, however, Miller says that he told President Trump a different story, informing him numerous times that there was not enough election fraud to have changed the election. Miller. My understanding is that I think there are still very valid questions and concerns with the rules that were changed under the guise of COVID, but specific to election day fraud and irregularities, there were not enough to overturn the election. Committee staff. And did you give your opinion on that to the president? Miller, yes. Committee staff. What was his reaction when you told him that? Miller, you haven't seen or heard? I'm paraphrasing, but you haven't seen or heard all the different concerns and questions that have been raised? Committee staff, how many times did you have this conversation with the president? Miller, several. I couldn't put a number on it, though. But more than one? Correct. Matthew Morgan, the Trump's top lawyer, came to a similar conclusion. Matthew Morgan. Nearly 2 months after the election, on January 2nd, Morgan met with the vice president's staff. According to Morgan, the consensus in the room was that even if all the claims of fraud and irregularities were aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative. As far as the Trump campaign's professional leadership was concerned, there was no evidence that the election had been stolen from President Trump. To the contrary, they had seen ample evidence that President Trump simply lost and told the president so. On November 6th, where are we? November 4th. Jared Kushner arranged for the senior campaign staff to brief President Trump in the Oval Office on the state of the race. Since Election Day, Matt Oczkowski, the campaign's leading data expert, had tracked voting returns in the swing states to analyze the campaign's odds of success. Miller texted such updates on data from key states to Meadows. The Trump campaign's data did not add up to victory. Oczkowski delivered to the president in pretty blunt terms that he was going to lose. Who do we have? Jared Kushner? That's his son-in-law, right? I think. Matt Oczkowski. There were not enough outstanding votes in the battleground states for President Trump to overcome Biden's lead. President Trump disagreed and insisted that he would still prevail through legal challenges. But the data did not lie. On November 7th, the Associated Press called Pennsylvania and the overall presidential election for the former Vice President Biden. At that point, a small team of the president's campaign advisors, including Stepien, met with the president and told him that his path to victory was virtually non-existent. The campaign team conveyed to the president that his chance of success was only 5, maybe 10%. I mean, that's even too high, isn't it? Which Stepien explained to the committee was a very, very, very bleak assessment. November 7th. In retrospect, the campaign's estimate of a 5 to 10% chance of winning as of November 7th was far too optimistic. In one of the most favorable possible scenarios, for example, President Trump and his team would need to win recounts in Arizona and Georgia while also prevailing in litigation challenging absentee or vote-by-mail ballots in Wisconsin, or possibly Michigan or Pennsylvania. But the election wasn't even close to trigger automatic recounts in Arizona or Georgia. The narrowest margin of total votes between the two candidates was in Arizona, where former Vice President Biden won by more than 10,000 votes. This may seem like a small number of votes, but it was more than enough to avoid an automatic recount. As Benjamin Ginsburg, a longtime Republican elections lawyer, explained to the Select Committee, the 2020 election was not close. Previous campaigns had successfully challenged vote differentials in the hundreds, not thousands of votes. Ginsburg explained, "You don't just make up those sorts of numbers in recounts." Georgia performed a hand recount of all the ballots anyway, confirming within weeks of the election that Biden had won the state. Benjamin Ginsburg, his lawyer. Also, on January 6th, Arizona and New Mexico had conducted a statutory post-election audit of voting machines or randomly selected representative samples of ballots at the state and county level that affirmed the accuracy of their election results. Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, by January 6th. Not on January 6th. Chris Stirewalt, who led the elections desk at Fox News at the time, concurred with Ginsburg's analysis. Asked what President Trump's odds of victory were as of November 7th, Stirewalt replied, none. None. None victory. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign continued to crunch the numbers. On the morning of November 12th, Oczowski circulated among top campaign advisors a presentation describing what happened in each of the battleground states the campaign was monitoring. This analysis by the data team examined the turnout and margins on a county-by-county basis in a dozen states while also analyzing demographic changes that impacted the results. Among the states were Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Oczowski's team determined that President Trump lost each of those 6 states because Biden had performed better than Trump in certain areas like population centers or suburbs. Yet in the weeks that followed, Trump and his new legal team, the Clown Car, went to great lengths to challenge the results of the election in these 6 states, spreading multiple conspiracy theories. The voting data told a clear story. President Trump lost. But, regardless of the facts, the president had no intentions of conceding defeat. On election night, President Trump and Rudy Giuliani agreed that the president should just declare victory, even though he had no basis for doing so. Giuliani also told the Select Committee that President Trump asked him on November 4th to take over his campaign's legal operation. Giuliani thought the only way that it would work would be for the president to call the existing campaign team and announce Giuliani's takeover because, in Giuliani's words, quote, "They are going to be extraordinarily resentful because they don't like me already and I don't trust them." He said that the president agreed. Although Giuliani wouldn't assume leadership of the campaign's legal operations until mid-November, the former New York City mayor quickly began to butt heads with Team Normal. On November 6th, Giuliani and his team met with Trump campaign's leadership at its headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Team Normal was not impressed. Stepien told the Select Committee the campaign team was concerned that Giuliani would be a distraction to them and to President Trump. When Giuliani suggested traveling to Pennsylvania to assist in the campaign's efforts, the campaign team didn't dissuade him from doing so. After just 10 to 15 minutes in the conference room, Stepien and other staffers left the meeting. The same day, President Trump discussed the campaign's legal strategy in the Oval Office with Giuliani, Clark, and Matt Morgan, the Trump campaign's general counsel. Prior to the election, Morgan was responsible for the campaign's litigation strategy. Morgan and his team filed lawsuits challenging the changes states made to voting practices during the coronavirus pandemic. Huh. Morgan also studied previous elections to determine the types of cases that were likely to succeed. Okay, that's good information. Clark described how the campaign's original legal strategy was based on his general theory for election cases, to look at what do you think, what do you know, and what can you prove, and then determine which cases to file from there. Giuliani had other ideas and advocated to President Trump that he be put in charge of the campaign's legal operation so that he could pursue his preferred strategy. Mr. Giuliani didn't seem bound by those cases or by those precedents. He felt he could press forward on anything that he thought was wrong with the election and bring a strategy around that. Rudy was just chasing ghosts, Clark said. Morgan and Clark excused themselves from the meeting because it was going nowhere. The next day, November 7th, Giuliani held a press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Oh, yeah. He immediately began making outlandish claims, arguing that the Democrats had conspired to steal the election. As you know from the very beginning, mail-in ballots were a source of some degree of skepticism, if not a lot of skepticism, as being innately prone to fraud, Giuliani said. Those mail-in ballots could have been written the day before by the Democratic Party hacks that were all over the convention center. Giuliani offered no evidence to support his shocking and baseless allegation. Echoes of President Trump's relentless campaign against mail-in balloting and his decision to exploit the red mirage were easy to hear. On November 10th, Giuliani and Carrick met with President Trump in the Oval Office to discuss their investigation into voter fraud. White House counsel Pat Cipollone and White House senior advisor Eric Hirschman were also in attendance. After Giuliani's presentation, President Trump asked Cipollone whether he had spoken to Attorney General Barr about the allegations of fraud. One day before, Barr had issued a memorandum outlining a shift in DOJ policy that allowed federal prosecutors to investigate claims of voting irregularities without waiting for the results to be certified. President Trump's question was an early indication that he was going to pressure the DOJ to endorse his phony fraud claims. Days later, Giuliani and Justin Clark engaged in a screaming match during a meeting in the Oval Office. Giuliani was urging President Trump to file a lawsuit in Georgia, but Clark pointed out that a hand recount was already being conducted and argued it was better to wait. Giuliani told President Trump that Clark was lying to him. A formal changing of the guard would follow. On November 14th, President Trump announced on Twitter that Giuliani was now the head of his campaign's legal team. Team Normal saw drastic changes to their roles on the newly structured campaign team, some self-imposed, and many outside law firms that had signed up to support the campaign's legal efforts disengaged completely. I don't think that what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time, Stepien explained. This wasn't a fight that I was comfortable with, he added. On the day the leadership change was announced, Giuliani participated in a surrogate briefing to coordinate messaging by Trump loyalists during their media appearances. Giuliani announced that the messaging strategy should be to go hard on Dominion Smartmatic, bringing up Chavez and Maduro. Giuliani claimed that additional lawsuits would soon be filed to invalidate upwards of 1 million ballots. Dominion. Consistent with the messaging advanced by the new campaign team, President Trump in mid-November remained dug in, still refusing to concede defeat. President Trump continued to insist that he was cheated out of victory, endorsing one wild conspiracy theory after another to deny the simple fact that he lost. President Trump had his day in court. Oh, shit. Okay, Joe Neal. I'm wiped out. I gotta get to sleep. Thanks for joining. See you back tomorrow. We'll read more of January 6th and Trump and how he tried to convince the world that the Democrats stole the 2020 election. Have a good night.